You look at a map of Europe today and, it feels pretty set in stone, right? But the modern European nation state, it actually came out of this wild, chaotic mix of utopian dreams and some incredibly bloody realities. So let's dive right into this explainer and unpack exactly how this whole chapter of history unfolded. To really wrap our heads around this chapter, we're going to follow the journey in 6 steps. First, the utopian dream. Then, defining the nation. 3, hardship and revolt. 4, forging Germany and Italy. 5, visualizing the nation. And finally, number 6, the imperial turn. All right, section 1, the utopian dream, a world of republics. Just think about the sheer scale of the vision presented by the French artist Frédéric Soriot in his famous 1848 print. He imagined a world made entirely of what he called democratic and social republics. He envisioned the peoples of Europe and America marching together in this massive, long train, grouped together as distinct nations, and they're peacefully walking right past the shattered, literal ruins of absolute monarchies lying on the ground, all while paying homage to the Statue of Liberty. I mean, it is the absolute picture-perfect utopian dream of global fraternity. But of course, to understand how we actually get there, we gotta ask a pretty foundational question. Section 2. Defining the nation-state beyond borders. So what actually is a nation? Back in an 1882 lecture, the French philosopher Ernest Renan really pushed back hard against the idea that a nation is just about sharing a language or living on the same piece of land. Instead, he argued that a nation is actually the culmination of a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion. To him, it's an active, daily plebiscite. Basically, it's forged through the continuous, collective will of a people who actively want to perform great deeds together. And those real-world struggles to build these nations, they have a very clear starting line. In 1789, the French Revolution sparked the first real expression of nationalism. Suddenly, you have these new concepts of citizen and fatherland, which Napoleon's armies then carried all across Europe. But as you probably know, Napoleon loses the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and by 1815, the conservative powers at the Congress of Vienna tried to just hit the rewind button, redrawing borders to try and crush the very nationalism that had just been unleashed. But here's the thing. You can't really put that genie back in the bottle. Which brings us to Section 3, hardship and popular revolt, the gritty reality. Those conservative regimes after 1815 went all in on suppressing liberal ideas. You can picture it perfectly through the 1820 caricature called The Club of Thinkers, where intellectuals are portrayed literally gagged. Autocracies completely outlawed intellectual freedom. They censored books, plays, songs, basically anything that even whispered about liberty. There's even a plaque in the cartoon that sarcastically states, "Silence is the first commandment of this learned society." Now, you can gag a philosopher, for sure, but you absolutely cannot gag hunger. By the 1840s, cheap machine-made imports and massive unemployment had created just desperate economic hardship. Take a Silesian village in 1844, for example. Contractors were ruthlessly exploiting this desperation, slashing wages left and right. So on June 4th, an angry crowd of weavers finally marched to their contractor's mansion, demanding fair pay. They were met with total scorn, so they smashed their way in and completely shredded the supplies of cloth. The contractor actually fled, called in the army, and in the clash that followed, 11 weavers were tragically shot. This wasn't just abstract philosophy anymore, it was literal survival. At the exact same time, the educated middle class was launching their own liberal revolts in 1848. They were out there demanding freedom of the press and democratic constitutions. But there's a pretty massive, glaring hypocrisy in their whole utopian vision. Because while these liberal men were demanding freedom from absolute monarchs, they actively denied those exact same political rights to women. And this is despite the fact that women were founding newspapers and fighting on the political front lines right beside them. Eventually, all those abstract dreams and street barricades had to give way to some real hard power. Section 4. Forging Germany and Italy, Politics and Power. When it came to actually creating unified states, the approaches were totally different depending on where you looked. Take Germany. Its unification definitely wasn't born out of democratic parliaments. It was top-down, driven by Prussian military dominance and the incredibly ruthless political maneuvering of Otto von Bismarck. It was quite literally a process of blood and iron. Now, contrast that completely with Italy. Sure, there was royal leadership involved, but a massive chunk of Italian unification was driven by grassroots popular mobilization. We're talking about the famous freedom fighter Giuseppe Garibaldi and his huge army of volunteer fighters.
two wildly different paths to building a modern nation-state.
Okay, so once these states were actually forged in blood and iron, they ran into a pretty massive branding problem. Let's look at Section 5, visualizing the nation, giving the state a face. Think about it. How do you get millions of totally diverse citizens to emotionally connect with a completely abstract political entity? Well, artists and politicians figured it out by using allegories. That's when you express an abstract idea, like a nation or liberty, through a physical figure. To give the state a concrete form, artists usually used a female figure. She wasn't meant to represent any real-life woman, she was literally the face of the nation. Over in France, this allegorical figure was named Marianne. She represented the idea of a people's nation, and she pulled her characteristics straight from the French Revolution, complete with the red cap and the tricolor. And honestly, the deployment of this was brilliant. They put Marianne's statues in public squares, stamped her face on everyday coins, put her on postage stamps. It was this constant, everyday visual branding to build a shared national identity. Following suit, Germany adopted its own allegory, Germania. She became the ultimate visual representation of the German nation, and she was almost always depicted wearing a prominent crown of oak leaves. Why oak? Well, in their cultural context, the German oak specifically symbolizes heroism and strength. It was the perfect visual shorthand for the character of the newly united German peoples. But it's incredibly fascinating to trace how this visual branding actually shifts alongside political reality. Take the year 1850, for example. We see the fallen Germania. She looks tragic, defeated, which totally makes sense after the failure of the liberal revolutions. But fast forward just a decade later, and the narrative completely flips. We get a militant Germania guarding the Rhine. She's standing strong, wielding a sword that literally has a promise inscribed on it to protect German lands. The image of the nation had hardened, right? Going from a defeated democratic ideal into an aggressive military protector. And you know, that militant shift perfectly sets up our final act for this chapter. Section 6, Nationalism and Imperialism. The dream sours. By the time we hit the late 19th century, nationalism had entirely shed those idealistic roots we started with. It completely lost that liberal democratic sentiment of those peaceful republics artists like Soryu were dreaming about. Instead, it devolved into this narrow, heavily intolerant creed. Nationalist groups became fiercely hostile toward one another. And major European powers? They were more than happy to manipulate those nationalist aspirations to just fuel their own imperialist expansion and global dominance. So this entire incredible journey from an artist's dream of global fraternity to the gritty, brutal reality of empire leaves us with a pretty profound question to wrap up this explainer. How exactly did a utopian dream of peaceful, democratic republics devolve so completely into the fierce imperialism that ultimately set the stage for global conflict? It's a massive reminder for us today of how easily powerful unifying ideas can be twisted from liberation straight into domination. Hopefully, this chapter of history gives you a fresh perspective next time you look at a map of Europe. Thanks for joining me.